So I will say that I didn't know John's architecture when I came back from architecture school. I came back in, there we go. I came back from Vancouver around 1985, I guess, 86. I had worked with some of John's sons. John was kind of my mother's age, generation older than me. And I knew a little bit, I'd heard a little bit about him, and I expected quite an intimidating, austere person. Am I clear here? And I was working for a very fine firm, Victoria, with John Wade and Terry Williams, and began to hear a bit more about John, who had also worked for the firm 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier. And Monday Magazine asked me at the time if I wanted to do an article on John Di Castri. So I phoned John and went over to meet him. And again, expecting someone really a bit intimidating. You know, he was very tall, kind of imposing kind of appearance. And I knew his sons, so I had some reputation of John being kind of a paternal. I met John, and I was immediately impressed with just how friendly and relaxed and humble he was, understated. And he had a little undertone of impatience sometimes, but he was really a charming and enchanted person. That's what I'd say. This is the first drawing that John showed me on my first meeting him, and it set me off kind of towards this whole exhibit for all of us. This was possibly one of John's first design drawings when he had returned himself from architecture school around 1950-51 to Victoria from studying with Bruce Goff. And so John brought this little drawing out and said, well, I started off like you know, kind of not knowing what I was going to do with myself coming back to Victoria. And I tried a few things out. And here's one of the first houses I tried. And he knew that this would grab my fancy. And here it was, this double helix spiral plan. And, you know, I'd studied architecture in some depth. I'd never seen anything like this. And it just took me off the charts in terms of the regard for his creativity. And that was one of John's key themes when he talked about architecture. He again, was self-effacing, but he said, it's a creative endeavor. I listen to music, I'm interested in art, I read poetry, I talk with, you know, everyone under the sun. And it all comes together like a sponge. You know, the more you soak into a sponge, the more you can squeeze out. So that was John's metaphor for creativity. So this set him off to probably one of his first significant projects in Victoria, the Dunsmuir House. And we'll get to watch the Dunsmuir House being built. It was designed for a rocky outcrop on 10 Mile Point. Robin Dunsmuir, who was the grandson, I guess, of the premier, Dunsmuir, had commissioned John with his wife to conquer this very difficult, rocky, irregular site. And you can see the response to the site. The building was fitting itself around the rock outcrops and the landscaping. The design that we saw in the plan earlier was not arbitrary. It was kind of sprung from the context. So John was really authentically designing specifically for a context. And again, his theme of creativity. Creativity, things come to you, and then you consider them, and then out it comes. So the design was not arbitrary, but it was also highly crafted. So it had an inset duct system in the slab. You can see the workers building it. Apparently, the Dunsmuirs also participated in both the design and the construction. For John's clients throughout his career, kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright, the relationship to John was very memorable, but also the clients, the biggest part of the experience was watching the house come into being. And so this is a big part of what John involved everyone in, is sort of seeing the construction itself. The other factor is John had worked as an architectural technician. He was a superb draftsman, had worked with with John Wade's firm as a senior technician. He was just a masterful building technician. On the other side, though, he used very, very standard materials often, especially for these early houses, but he used them so creatively. So plywood was suddenly a mass market material in the early 50s. In-slab heating was a new thing. John was on the vanguard. Stick framing. John suddenly took standard stud framing and turned it into these wonderful curving forms. And he also loved natural materials, the rock retaining walls and so on. So he was pulling in all directions towards this new design. One adventure it would have been for him, but also for his clients. Now here's Robin Dunsmuir and his wife, who apparently was very fashionable. Also very, they were searching for a really experimental house, and John was given this great occasion, again, his first project. And so they were fully on participants. So John was an immersive kind of, consultant to these people. And the house was spectacular when it was built. It had extremely futuristic originality, as I say here, but at the same time it was intimate in scale, and all the rooms were just oriented the right way for the light, the views, fitting to the rocky landscape. It was a real tour de force of kind of pouring a design into the specifics of a site. Very windy site on the end of 10 Mile Point, so the building had sheltering elements as well as open viewing elements. It had a bit of everything. He captured the spaces around the building really effectively. It was an instant masterpiece, and it got instant raporious response from the media. So the Times columnists and the Times and the columnists, the two newspapers, both wrote about it. John was an instant celebrity for this house in Victoria. Again, young architect, a neophyte, and he'd done a few smaller bits of houses, but this is his first real creation. And instantly his name was synonymous with architecture in Victoria. The sophistication as well, the house it came from, as I said, rustic beginnings, but its overall effect was so sophisticated. The curving international plate glass wall. So he took the international style, there's bits of that in there, he turned it into a seashell form, he took the post and beam and turned it into a radial expression, and as Allan's talked about, he brought the interior sweeping through the exterior sweeping through the interior of the house. Architects were also just floored with John's talents. The house was well preserved, and here's Robin Dunsmuir and some friends. The image, which I just received these construction images and early occupancy images a few days ago. And the image on the left is 1968. So Robin Dunsmuir still owned the house then. It was beautifully maintained into the late 80s. And then, unfortunately, it was bought and very unsympathetically renovated. They ruined the house. They sort of put a big pink, orange marshmallow of stucco on top of it. And I'm afraid it probably could not be restored without a lot of rebuilding, I think. But it might be worth it, because if this house had been built in Los Angeles, it would be a touchstone for the city. In Victoria, we kind of just let it go. So there's a lesson in that, and that's one of the reasons I also got quite enthusiastic about John's buildings, because I knew that in time they would be at risk. So here's one of his second houses. This is the Smith House out in Colwood, and it's actually based on one of Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas, which was the hemispherical, semicircular house facing the sun, capturing the sun, sheltering itself from the cold north winds. A lot of those houses were built in the Midwest and in the south of the States. So John kind of adopted the idea and made it his own. It's got, as Allan was saying, multi-level floors, multi-level roofs. And you could not have designed this kind of house with all these elaborations and tricky forms without being one of the most skilled architectural technicians imaginable. So here's John's working drawing, and it's got a curved arc form with semicircular segments inside the plan. Very tricky to draw. Looks like an effortless drawing. John, his vision, what must have just been boiling away inside him, but then he was able to execute it so well. He was so skilled as a designer and a technician. Plus, he understood construction. He was not an abstract kind of creation of form. He wanted things to be applied and built, and he knew fully well how to do that. So he was really the complete gamut as an architect. So the house is a bit of Corbusier, a bit of Bruce Goff, a bit of who knows what. But the design, a bit of Frank Lloyd Wright, lots of that. The technical challenges of the design to get it built were really amazing. And John's drawings, we can still see them at the university, were beautiful, beautiful, clear construction drawings. So he knew every detail about how these buildings would go together. Again, this is his second major house, I think. You'd have to say he was a prodigal. Plus the detailing on the house, the wood framing detailing, the curved soffits, just the delicacy and the intricacy of the house. Again, he had it all captured on paper. The builders, it was an experience for them building it, but it was all explained. It was all, John was very, very, he didn't miss a single element of what he intended to do in his drawings. And it went on. So creativity was the theme, and also, as I say at the top, innovation but integration. So he'd do something highly innovative, but he'd figure out how it was built. And that's one of the phrases that John would kind of share with me. He said, "You've got to know how it's built as an architect. You cannot just kind of create a flamboyant form. You need to have the respect for the construction." And he had all that in his designs and the drawings. He also designed often specifically for the clients, who became quite close with him. Charlie Watts, he talked about very exuberantly as I got to know John. Charlie Watts built this house himself, and John, worked with him on the design, and apparently Charlie Watts spent, a couple of years building the house. It's still in prime condition. But the sense of shared creativity and adventure, I think, and the endless variety of housing forms that John, he was so overwhelmed with the possibilities of becoming a young architect in Victoria. Imagine he was born in 1954, so he would be, 1924, he'd be 30, in his late 20s and 30s doing these houses. Confidence and experience that was, way ahead of his years. This is another extremely experimental house. Again, every house was an original creation. So this is the Hunt house, which wasn't actually built. It's on the waterfront in Cordova Bay. What is built, you can see it by the road, Cordova Bay Road, is the garage, which is also a hexagonal kind of little garage. You can spot it right by the road. But again, very influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, similar kind of design layouts, use of octagons. And beautifully presented. John's drawings, of course, were very persuasive and committed. So I apologize that some of my slides are a little bit fuzzy, but this is, of course, one of his next very fantastic houses, the Trent House. And again, it's applied design. He knew fully how to detail and design every piece of it. It's quite Frank Lloyd Wright-esque in many ways, but it's John's personality as well. The intersecting triangular and diamond forms. He often started with the impulse of a geometric form. And again, kind of like Bruce Goff, he learned from the Bruce Goff text, every house is supposed to be entirely creative and new. And that's something he tried to offer his clients. He worked really hard at it. This is a minuscule, it's a tiny house, but it is so efficiently laid out. I think this is similar to the original colors. It's been refurbished nicely. So creativity couldn't hold back. This is a barn that John converted for the Grahams, for Colin and Sylvia Graham. Colin was the director of the art gallery. I took classes from him as a kid. And Sylvia was trained as an architect, and they had a young, growing family, 3 boys, kind of my age and a bit younger. And they had to find an economic way to house them. So they bought an old barn and then hired Di Castri, who was just making his mark in Victoria, to convert the barn. And you can see the results. I think they participated in the construction as well. And they later, when things were a bit more established for them, they had John design a full new house out on 10 Mile Point in the 60s. John was very interested in the sites, the houses, very sensitive to nature. A lot of the houses were built on rock outcrops within groves of trees. He'd relate the views to the natural setting. The gardens would be planned to grow around the house, both as a combination of applied gardens and also the natural kind of landscape. So this is the Skilling's house. And John's reputation, this is the later 50s, all these houses were being published. He was a phenomenon. And I met a number of older architects that entered the profession because of the influence of John. They said, we've got to do this too. So he was iconic. And highly productive. So this is late in the 50s. Sorry, the image is a bit fuzzier than Allan's images. This was designed for a bridge engineer, Mr. Thompson, and his wife, using exposed post and beam system with steel columns and then glue lamp beams. John was very interested in the new technologies that were available in construction, used a lot of glue lamps, as you'll see in the churches. And so he wasn't holding back on current construction technology. And again, the house was abstractly kind of set in nature. It's the end of St. Francis Crescent. It's probably one of the nicest modern houses in the city of Victoria itself. We had it registered as or designated as a heritage structure, Victoria. And again, the reference to nature, it's kind of an abstract tree, if you will, set amongst these Gary oak trees. It has a concrete core, like a spine, and then it has these branches that outreach, and the house kind of reaches out into the landscape, top-heavy, very similar to the trees that it's set in. So John, again, he was a whirlwind, and he was so productive, worked so hard. He said, well, I had a burgeoning family to feed, and he was fun. You know, he made lots of jokes about you know, everything. But he worked so hard, obviously. So he was producing for often young clients who'd want a creative little house, very beautiful little creative projects. Every house was unique, beautifully presented. Most of them, I think, got built as he designed. A good number didn't carry through, but the drawings are still with us. And he would have been doing a drawing like this once a week, I would say, you know, at his prime in the 50s. Maybe once every 2 weeks, but the productivity was, and he was doing most of the work himself. As his firm and practice grew, of course, he gathered more people working with him. But a lot of this work came from his own hand, these little design sketches. Now, John showed me this drawing, and he said, you know, this is my favorite project. So I did this for a widow, lady who was just widowed up in Comox, and she just had a most meager kind of ability, you know, means. And he said, but she wanted something that had a design, and I've heard of John Di Castri. Could you do something for me? And he said it was the smallest house that he's designed, but it was, you know, he had such humility, kind of serving the purposes of this lady doing this designing, and it rung a chord with John. He was very proud of it. Now, we talked about the interiors. His interiors were often quite magnificent, integral with the house. These are interiors of the Trend house. He wasn't shy on using, you know, quite elaborate materials and bringing the geometry of the exterior of the house in, and also the lighting, as Allan was describing, and the fireplace focus. Very much an influence of Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was far and away his own kind of you know, high priest of architecture. He thought Frank Lloyd Wright was the ultimate kind of reference. But he also was interested in the other great architects. He was interested in Corbusier and Van der Rohe. He was kind of a meeting point, as I think Martin was saying, between organic architecture, high creativity, and high modernism. So you can see all those elements kind of coming together in John's work. When I studied architecture in the early 80s, it was an era where the modern movement was a little bit discredited, a little bit out of fashion, as many of us remember, and criticized for being bland and unpredictable and out of scale, and you know, all these criticisms of the mass construction of modernist buildings sort of into the late 20th century. And when I saw John's architecture, I realized, well, modernism doesn't have to be predictable or constrained. It can be just as creative as John's aspirations. So again, every house was so original, and this one was very influenced by the Prairie houses and Frank Lloyd Wright. Again, I don't have the crispest images, but I thought I'd put it into the, and I don't think I spelt the family name as well as Martin. Sorry. So we'll jump from the houses, which is a big part of the arc of John's career, to the some of his commercial buildings, which were also landmark, iconoclastic buildings. So this building, I don't have the image showing it set amongst little Victorian houses. As I think my friend Gene Miller said, it looks like a spaceship that landed in the middle of a cornfield. You know, it was so futuristic for 1951. And yet at the same time, it was done, again, with John's empathy with the client and his sort of gentle humility was done for the blind. So he wanted all the details to lead the blind sort of safely in, the curving walls. There's walls with textured kind of elements that would cue the blind, once they were familiar with the building, to be able to find their way. So it was a real little masterpiece. The McCall's Funeral Chapel, again, very indebted to Frank Lloyd Wright. Again, John gave me portions of his library as he was closing things down, and he must have had 100 books on Frank Lloyd Wright of all scales. He just studied Wright continuously and was obviously inspired by him. So this building, the McCall Brothers building, was so harmonious. Everything in it is skewed off a 15-degree angle. The slope of the roof, the windows, the walls, the side walls, which are all little segments of concrete block walls, were laid out with little strip windows. So you go into a memorial ceremony, and you'd have the solemnness in the memorial, and then you'd turn back and you'd see the light from the windows to illuminate the prospect of life as you left the chapel. So a lot of thought and a lot of I guess, meditation in John's buildings. This building, of course, was, Martin's talked about it. It was beautifully refinished a few years ago. Peter DeHoo and Lynn Gordon Finley, beautiful restoration. So I'm hoping that we're going to recognize John's work to hold on to a good portion of it, because how this multitude of highly creative buildings happen in little out-of-the-way Victoria is a marvel to me. We'll talk about that. So John in the 50s was doing more substantial commercial buildings. This building still mostly stands on Yates Street, just east of Cook Street, and it's got a fantastic remaining east face. The west face has been built over, but if you want to really see a great John Di Castri, commercial building with a wonderful structural expressiveness. He knew all the types of structural reinforced concrete framing and steel detailing. And he orchestrated it all into this very beautifully massed kind of building form. Worth a look. Now, I intentionally used kind of grainy photos to capture the mood and I guess I can use the word spirituality of some of John's churches. So this is the St. Patrick's Church, and again, it's like an epiphany, the way it draws you towards the altar, but it was designed as a spiritual, kind of contemplative experience. And it was designed as well with a sense of what's impressive, I've used the words here, is it impressive, imposing space, but it's kind of contemplative and personable. So all his buildings his churches especially have that quality where they're both, exuberant and kind of large and grand, pull you into a big sweep. But at the same time, there's a sense of you can be alone in the buildings and just be moved by them. So the intimacy is, I think, remarkable in his churches. And this is the Sacred Hearts Church. John was very, very interested in structures and structural engineering. And again, technically, he could not have been more attuned. This is up on the side of Christmas Hill. You'd have to look for it. I forget the name of the street it's on. I think it's Lake Street. It's a little parish church. It's in absolutely mint condition. It's never been renovated. It's got this very expressive dome over the church hall. John was very influenced by Vatican II or III, I forget what the number was, which reinvigorated the Catholic churches to become more participatory. And they changed some of the liturgy and so on. The churches were intended to be real community places. And so a lot of these little highly individualistic churches were built around Victoria. And again, John didn't hold back on expressing the structure. It's got a radial beam system with glue lamps with a compression beam along the bottom, but the top has this little oculus, this little light eye that's also a little compressive ring. So his structural engineers did marvels with John as well. And then a number of his churches are real landmarks around Greater Victoria, like the First Christian Reformed Church and then St. Joseph's Parish Church. Again, all just done in a stream, like year after year. John's work at UVic. I first attended UVic when the sub-building was in its full glory, and it's sad that it has not been well cared for. This is one of the risks, I think, when you do exceptional work. Sometimes it's exceptionally kind of underappreciated, and this building really should have been properly, brought forward and maintained at UVic because it was such a signature piece. But bits that are there, you can kind of still study and appreciate it. John was very influenced by the planning of the university, the development of the University of Victoria with big civic community enterprise in the late 50s and early 60s. It was a dream for Victoria to get a university, and they hired architects, and they assigned the architects to do very individualistic and I don't know the right word for it, but well detailed. The buildings were not routine at all. They were really encouraged to be artistic with the building designs. So this is the Cornet building around 1965, 66. And it's designed like a little quadrangle of courtyards. It was designed for the social sciences, as I say at the bottom, the psychology, philosophy, sociology, political science, and they each insisted on their own wing in the building. That's why the building is broken into all these complexities. And of course, as students at UVic, the joke was that you went in at your own risk to ever find the department you're supposed to be in. And the UBC engineers had a heyday with this. They came over one weekend when I was a student at UVic in the early 70s, and they put a beautifully built concrete block wall on the third floor to block one of the corridors. So you get in the building, and indeed you were trapped in a maze. So it was really good fun. But John's career kind of straddles the arts and crafts and the Bruce Goff and the Frank Lloyd Wright, but also has elements of the international style. And he was respectful of Mies van der Rohe and the great practitioners. And his buildings evolved. He has different sort of phases in his design work. We saw a lot of the 50s and early 60s. So in the 60s, a little later, he wasn't shy to do a building that was a form of international style. This is a proposal for an administration building at UVic. And John, in his own terms, he saw himself as a modernist. He saw himself as being pragmatic and form follows function, and my buildings, are not just a self-indulgent, they're effective and productive. He did commercial buildings downtown that are landmarks, like the, whoops, I've got the wrong text on the bottom, but this was the, I guess we call it Mosaic building now, which is designed as an office building. Now it's been converted into condominiums, and it's designed as a centennial building for the city centennial in 1962. It was finished in 63, but it has centennial mosaics on the front face. And this is part of the culture of the times, the centennial mania that overtook Victoria through the 1960s. Lots of centennial buildings and complexes in Victoria. And of course, he was also a participant in the downtown planning for Victoria in the 1960s, when they tried to cope with the challenges of suburbia and trying to keep downtown alive. And the parkade systems that the city built were part of the response. They wanted to array a series of civic parkades around certain areas of downtown to keep the suburban, car driving kind of population able to come conveniently downtown. And then once you're in downtown, there was a wonderful set of plans for walkway systems and malls and linkages from the parkades. So this is quite interesting urban planning from the 60s. And it culminated with Centennial Square and all the good architectural offices in Victoria. There was a little cluster of very productive and effective architectural offices, good architects. And they were all signed pieces of Centennial Square. John got another parkade, which is still in mint condition. It's beginning to have questions about its use and about its, a lot of these old parkades need a little bit of attention for seismic security. But it's still there, and it's a really interesting mid-century Di Castri building framing one side of the square. So its future, I think, is an interesting kind of question. A lot of these buildings are going to have to evolve or find new programs. So, and John had a 55-year career. So he was active in Victoria through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Again, a lot of his buildings had quickly been, shall we say, simplified. And a lot of the detailing on this building, which was very Di Castri-esque with these little finials and so on, has been stripped away. It was quite an interesting building. It's housing and busy streets. The corridors around the outside of the building with the units facing a landscape courtyard in the middle. So he was really trying to cope with, urbanizing conditions on busy streets. The building's still there. So we'll jump to his last project, major project, which I wanted to end on. We started watching the construction of his first major house, the Dunsmuir House, and I thought I'd finish with his last, really significant kind of house project, which he designed for McNeely's in the late 90s. I think it was finished in the early 2000s, and it's a showpiece project. John was he was kind of near the end of a long, productive life, but the energies were not, and the enthusiasm and the creativity wasn't dimmed. This house is beautifully set in a sort of a forested site on a rocky knoll, very echoing of the Dunsmuir House. The house is designed around the site. It kind of wanders back and forth between the trees and the views with a regular plan. And if you get a chance to visit, it's a gorgeous house. It's also designed to capture spaces around the house, little courtyard spaces in the elbows of the house with beautiful little gardens and ornamental areas to sit and a wonderful waterfront view and a very Frank Lloyd Wright bay window facing the water. Beautifully maintained house, and it's kind of full circle for John. Again, this is the end of his career was still a climax. And this house is I think, it's a bit of a masterpiece. Frank Lloyd Wright would have been proud to have designed this house, and John was kind of serving the cause, carrying the baton that Frank Lloyd Wright had passed along. So there we go, an overview of John's career.
Question from Martin. He's wondering if anyone here is fortunate to live in a Di Castri house.
Oh, yeah, a couple.
Which one?
Which ones? Can we ask?
Oh, that's my house.
There we are.
Very lucky.
Yes.
And may I ask you which yours is?
We just live 4 doors up from Joan in one of his 1957 house. It's a small bungalow.
There's lots of them around.
Okay, and
I have a question about the connection between the architects working in Victoria and Vancouver and the architects that were working at the time in Washington State, in Seattle, and some of the other, Olympia. Were there, I never hear about any architects from that area. Was there any connection between the architects working here and the people in Washington State and
Yes. So
the coastal Washington?
So it's an interesting question because I think those of us, if you live here now, you travel around a lot. People, go to Seattle for concerts, and some people spend half their lives in Vancouver doing whatever it is they do in Vancouver. but in those days, Victoria was much more isolated. And so, particularly during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the architects who worked here tended to be a group, very much a conscious group. But there wasn't a lot of communication. Having said that, of course, things were, as pointed out earlier on, Allan, things were published. And everybody read the journals. And in popular magazines, that kind of thing. So there was that kind of a connection. But even things like going and working in another architect's office in, say, Vancouver or Seattle or something, much more rarely was that the case.
I think Peter Cotton did a road trip down to California, And he visited some of the houses in California. And also in Seattle, he went to there was a director of the, what's one of the galleries there, the really good gallery on the university. He was director of the gallery, a very nice house on Mercer Island or something like that. So I think there was communication that way. And I know there's a house in Vancouver that's designed by a Seattle architect, quite a well-known Seattle architect, the name escapes me right now.
So this was obviously prior to the time
So-
where architects dealt with all of it.
Yeah, and there was a direct connection too with San Francisco through the work of the architects for the University of Victoria campus. They had a overall architectural firm that directed
Worcester.
the planning of the campus. Worcester Bernardi Emmons. They came up quite often, and sometimes one of them would speak to, in fact, the local chapter of the RI.
I think the Trend House program was in some way related to the case study houses in California. There was at a time when demonstration houses were sort of the thing, and a lot of the world looked to the case study houses in Los Angeles. And I think the Trend House program was in some degree based on that same idea.
So I think there was quite a bit of communication at different levels, but Victoria really was isolated, and it had its own little community, little artistic community. And that was the question I was going to put out to everyone here. How could a career like this have happened in Victoria? Victoria was very provincial. It had a great creative flourish up to the First World War. It couldn't be more creative and productive, great architects. But it had fallen in quietude. And I think after the war, there was a bit of a resurgence in the economy, certainly. And the young architects coming out of school, the new University School of Architecture at UBC. So Peter Cotton and a few other architects came from UBC. But as Di Castri himself put it, I came back to Victoria, and it was kind of a wish and a hope that I'd have a career. The economy was a little bit better. And then somehow he just created this explosive, creative output of buildings. I mean, it's amazing. And other architects were doing fairly well as well. But Victoria was kind of encapsulated in a way. It really had it developed its own mid-century culture, I think. And a lot of good architects from the 50s and 60s, Alan Hodson and David Hambleton, John Wade, and later architects like Roger Smith. So there was a real architectural culture here that was in isolation. And I think that was like a fertile little ground. The other thing was the building sites were so phenomenal here. And there was a little bit of an arc of people retiring here, so they want a nicer house. So it was an opportunity that was in a vest pocket in a way. It was a really isolated little place. And Victoria has always felt overshadowed in recent years by Vancouver and Seattle and so on. So there was also a little bit of a xenophobia, I think, that was part of it as well. But that's one of the questions to me is how could all this creativity have happened in that era? And it's partly because Victoria can foster creativity. It can, it can be a fertile place, and it's proven here.
Take the lady first.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I know you all, and it's wonderful. Delightful to meet all our old friends, the architects. I work with many of them. I have a question about the Trend House, because my parents, immigrants from England, were very proud to buy their first modern real house on Carnarvon Street, and it was only the second house on that entire subdivision, and I loathed it. It was 1955, and it was a box. And nobody planted trees or anything. Gradually it grew up. But then the Trend House came along. Well, they were horrified. Who'd want to live in that?
Yeah.
And I never went into it, so I've been always intrigued because you could see it for a long time, but now you can't. It's just covered. So my question is, has it been preserved, and is somebody taking care of it?
Yeah, there was a young couple that bought it 20 years ago, and their intention was to really look after it. right down to buying the furniture that was originally there. They were looking for hoop chairs and that sort of thing. They had a separation. I don't know who bought it more recently, but they're the ones who installed the very tasteful, doorway over there, not a door, but a gate at the entrance that's, very well done. And they were very concerned about, the condition of the wood. The wood was cupping, all the siding was cupping. So I think they had a lot of repairs to do. I don't know who the current owner is, but I think they did quite a good job. And I think they needed to, the family was growing, so I think they did put a small addition. There had been addition already put on it. But I think up until when they bought it, it was, the weather was starting to really wreak havoc with some of the cladding.
I worked with a previous owner to design an addition, so I did a couple of little studies for an addition. And again, it's on a big lot for the size of the house, and it's a tiny house. So everyone was feeling, it was recognized that it was a distinctive kind of landmark post-war house. And that's growing now. It's kind of known right across the country. And so it's been restored beautifully, but it needs a bit more space. So because the lot is fairly big, I was able to show the way a wing could have been built slightly detached from the house, kind of in the same gesture of the house. And that's yet to happen. So, again, John's, there were criticisms of John's work. I wanted to get into that too. Was he, universally kind of, seen as a white knight? And some of the architects of the day said, "Oh, wow, he's so creative, he's so great, but he can't hold back. There's just too much." And I remember talking to the director of our School of Architecture, who knew John really well. He was a contemporary of John's. He said, "Oh yeah, he knew John through the 50s. He said, "Well, what, you could not have had a more creative architect, but he really, he just went a little bit too far with the details and the ornament, and his houses would have been better a little more tame." So he had his critics too, as well as his enthusiasts.
Compared to Goff, though.
Yeah, compared to Goff. But for me, Di Castri kind of met the imaginative and the practical. Like his buildings were still really well built, and they did thoughtfully represent the needs of the people they were commissioning, as well as searching for some kind of creativity. So I think he's exceptional. Now, Bruce Goff came to lecture in Vancouver when I was just finishing architecture school. The Elcan series hosted him for a lecture. It was just the year before he passed away, and he did a wonderful lecture. Huge crowd, maybe, I don't know, almost 1,000 people to hear this. A standing ovation, and Bruce Goff was grinning from ear to ear. And I looked sideways, and there was John Di Castri on the side stage. And I was close enough to hear, and Goff turned around and pointed at John Di Castri and said to the group of people on stage, "Now there's a real architect." So John was recognized as being an applied master. He wasn't just a creative master, he was applied. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty loud. It might be the answer might be obvious, but with the Mosaic building, you talked about artists working with architecture. Do you know who did the mosaic work on the Mosaic building?
There's a Mexican guy. I've got the article on it, but I can't remember the name of the guy.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of controversy about it. The art gallery, a lot of people at the art gallery hated it. It was goofy and, flamboyant and, all that. But I could find the article for you. It's interesting, but it was not well liked, not well received by a lot of people.
Curious.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I think the Mexican guy had done murals around the world, so I guess it came as a bit of a surprise when people weren't always that happy with it.
Thank you.
There's one more back here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I did have the pleasure of working for John for a while. I worked on this house right here, so it was very interesting, a lot of fun. Just on the whole 50s, I think what I would say is, even when they say it's not about the money, it's always about the money. So back then, it was very hard to get a mortgage. Like, banks didn't provide mortgages. But for war vets, there was money from the federal government. And if you had a house designed and the floor plans were approved by the government, then you could get money to build your house, and the money came in stages. I think, you know, one tranche for the foundations and one when it was framed up, and then, you know, closed in, and then when it was finished. So that propelled a boom in housing in the 50s for all these vets who were coming home, getting married and having kids. And I think a lot of John's work was associated with that boom in housing. So people moving up and moving somewhere else and moving into the suburbs and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it was about the money as well.
You've spoken extensively on how Di Castri's work was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright and Goth. Was he recognized widely beyond the local scene?
Still not. So John has a pretty good reputation around Victoria. His houses are sought, you know, for just real estate value and imagination and signature pieces and beautifully designed. And some reputation in Vancouver, but then it peters out, you know, and I think there were very few knowledgeable architects who knew of his work through Western Homes and Living. His houses in the 50s were published often. Mm-hmm. And so there were a number of architects back east, but in terms of the totality of, you know, recognition across the country, I would say it just peters out by the time you get to Abbotsford. So,
Yeah.
And this is one of the hopes of this exhibit, that we can kind of show this outstanding kind of architectural career and show it off as a point of pride for Victoria, and also as a recognition of what can be done. You know, John was, he was instructing us how creative you can be.
I think too that there only are 3 or 4 architects in Canada that were practicing sort of the Frank Lloyd Wright approach. There's one in Quebec and 3 on the coast. And I don't know if people in Eastern Canada would know of Hollingsworth. They know of Ron Tom, because he built a lot in the East. He moved there. But the other 2 are not. Hollingsworth is known locally, very much so in Vancouver, in the Fraser Valley, but not so much in Alberta or the rest of the country. And it may just be that, you know, there are clients here that were attracted to the Frank Lloyd Wright aesthetic, but not so much in the rest of the country. Maybe something to do with climate or the sort of the look of the buildings that reflected desert conditions, or, you know, what are the Midwest climate or whatever, but that they weren't, that sort of style was not attractive to people in the East. Because I don't think Hollingsworth is known much beyond BC. Maybe more so now, but he was pretty much a local phenomenon too.
There's some pretty celebrated architects in Canada, but they are the higher echelon, you know, like Arthur Erickson and Douglas Cardinal, you know, who did very internationally kind of recognized buildings, Cardinal's churches, and got him an international reputation, and he's had commissions down in Washington for great museums and so on. So there is a strata of architects who make it internationally from Canada, but it's pretty limited. Arthur Erickson, of course, is exceptional. And there's a few in the big cities back east. There's very good architects, particularly in the big cities in Canada, you know, excellent work. But a little homegrown operation like Fred Hollingsworth or John Di Castri, they're kind of overlooked, you know. Mm-hmm. And yet it tells us so much about, you know, what a dedicated talent can do with good clients. So I think this is exemplary. That's the other cause of the purpose of the exhibit, I guess.
Are there any plans for the exhibit to travel? Or is this just because I'm thinking that part of getting the reputation out is if this exhibit could be taken across the country or around the province?
Well, that would be our hope. We don't know. Now, the exhibit is partly sponsored by the RAIC, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. So I'm a participant in that group locally, and they supported the exhibit. They knew we had already, got it well underway. And there's been some talk about them adopting it. Allan's done a great job. All the models have containers so they can be stored and moved. So the exhibit could move along, but it's going to take a little bit of reaching out and finding out who would like to show it. The exhibit was also sponsored by the Wentworth and the Hallmark Society. Ken Johnson over there were supporters. So if everyone could put the word out to see if there's another locale that could go to the exhibit. Going to be finishing here in September. We can store it for a while. We hope that we can find further purpose for it.
There's some interest by the RAIC of showing it at their next annual general meeting, which is in Vancouver. So we're going to explore that opportunity. The other thing is, it's modular. It comes in modules. It started out much smaller, less than half the size of what you see here. So it could go to other venues and be, edited and reworked appropriately. So, yeah.
I'm trying to get my 2 cents worth in here. My whole life in Victoria has been influenced by a book on McClure. And I take that book, and I find that book, I open the book, buy a house by McClure. I say to myself, boy, this is an unusual house in this book. And anyway, I end up moving into a big 1919 house designed in 1914, influenced entirely by a hardcover book with good pictures in it, and the stories that are told in it. And we here tonight have heard interesting stories, anecdotes. It calls out for a hardcover book because that will outlast my iPhone, my list of websites to go to, and my memory of this thing, because it'll capture it. So someone needs to produce a book. And the book can be last generations, and we'll go back to books. In fact, you can still buy books. And my wife wants the books out of the house, but she allows the architectural books to stay. So someone's got to do a book. It just calls out for it.
Yep.
Well, we have a very accomplished architectural historian, and that we've been prompting him.
And I've been nudging Chris.
Well, we might start with a catalog. And I talked to Rob over there the other day, and he said there's got to be a collective source we can find about where to find John's buildings and what they are and when they were. And it's due. It's well due. And again, the buildings are at risk. They go out of fashion, and they get run down, and people renovate. Oh, we want a new bathroom, a new kitchen, and you begin to lose the quintessence of it. So that was one of the reasons for the first exhibit, because I knew that John's work would be, kind of out of fashion and at risk. So that's still in the balance, I think.
Any more questions? Is there ever any kind of open house, Victoria, where you can, I know they have this in Toronto, where you can go into these architectural projects on a certain day of the year and the people that own them invite people to come in and look at them. Is there anything like that here?
Well, not formally. The art gallery does house tours, basically for interior design and art. Gardens. But architectural house tours, it's hard to convince people to open their houses, I guess. Now, we have been fortunate that we've toured three of us have toured a number of John's houses over the years, but it's not like you just knock on the door and there you're brought in. And a lot of houses are quite humble as well. They're modest. They're done for just ordinary people. So they're not grandiose, but they have a bit of flair, and he gave them some attention of creative possibilities. So they're worth knowing about.
I think it's the first step to saving a lot of these houses. People have to be able to see them. So I think I'd like to see, coming out of this group, a map with addresses. Then you can go and look at them. And that's the first step. And then more and more people do that. And then there's concern over their preservation. That would be something I'd be quite interested in, at least getting a list of addresses and just making sure people aren't belligerent and pushy, just go by and take a picture or whatever you can get away with and leave it at that.
I'd like this to also serve for young architects to see what you can do with your career, so having the material collective and people, entering the profession, looking through it and saying, why stop there, I think that could be another good use.
I heard of a bike tour, an architectural bike tour. Does anybody know about that?
Hallmark did that. How many times, Ken? Maybe
4 or 5 times. We had bike tours. Tried to go by neighborhoods, so you weren't going all over town.
Mm-hmm.
And, they were fairly well attended by bikers.
That's fine.
Okay, we've got another question here.
It's not so much the question, but I just wanted to bring up, there's a couple more people who relate to this, and it's kind of similar for me. There's a fellow named John Lautner, who's the same generation as Goff, maybe similar to John here. And I remember in '92 I was in Vienna, and they were setting up an exhibition for John Lautner. And I thought, I saw some of his drawings, and they're just wood frame, most of them. And I thought, what a boring bunch of stuff, because I was working for Coop Himmelblau at the time, and Hans Hollein and these guys, and I thought, geez. And then when they showed a Steadicam walkthrough of his Acapulco house, I don't know if you guys know it, I just realized he was working on an entirely different plane. And this guy was 75, he'd never had a monograph. He has 4 James Bond houses. He kind of pioneered the highway motel look and the gas station look. And he's also kind of like a silent character, even though his work is profound. And he died at 83 with a couple of, he never worked on the computer. And he had a couple of drawings in the office, and he just did 2 or 3 houses a year for his whole career. And a very similar kind of idea. And there's another guy named Narendra Gandhi, who was actually an Indian, who worked at Taliesin and then went back to India. And he also had his own idiosyncratic approach. And he's well known in studying architecture in India. But he also only did 4 or 5 houses because he refused to draw. He just went to the place and built it. In India you can do that. And so I think there's a family of people like this who are spread out all over, which comes from Frank Lloyd Wright. And I think he belongs to that family in a very real way, even though he's maybe 1 step removed from Goff, but his work still pays attention to Wright so strongly. And I think there's something to be said. If a book about him comes out, I think it's also relevant to put him into this family of people who work in this particular way, which wasn't the way Frank Lloyd Wright worked, right? It's they already knew what Frank Lloyd Wright did, and all of these guys took a step beyond and started working in a different way. And the last observation I had, because this is new to me, is that I think working with Goff, who had a tremendous amount of stuff to get over himself, right? He was an unusual fellow, let's say, and he was a first in many ways and had to pioneer himself. And I think that Di Castri got a lot of inspiration from him just to plow through the naysayers and to forget about all that junk and just do what you need to do. Because I I was there at that lecture in, what was it, 80 something, or
84,
81?
yeah, 85.
80, I don't know, I was there. And I remember him being so adamant about just doing what you need to do and not worrying about, and that's how his work looks, right? So I think that was a big component about how he could succeed here in Victoria, which was definitely not that kind of atmosphere, right? So those are just some comments I wanted to add.
So there's a interesting kind of connectivity in all these things. So John did his own grand tour, in the great 18th and 19th century tradition, immediately after school. Put his wife and their minimal luggage in a car, and literally drove around the United States visiting Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings. And in the Progress, Royal Progress, they ended up at Taliesin, where they actually met Frank Lloyd Wright. And but I wonder at the time. So, and I need to check this, but I'm almost sure by that time, John Rattenbury's son, was studying at Taliesin, and later took over the role of Frank Lloyd Wright there. He headed up the Taliesin School. So here are these sort of little pieces that, and you just kind of wonder all the time about, who and what and where and how the pieces fit together or don't. So on John's trip, he took slides, and he had a 45, remember slide drums? He had a slide drum of that trip. And although I never saw him give the lecture, he must have given it numerous times because they were well worn. And I showed it once in public, but the slides were in such a perilous state that we had to then, put it to bed in good conservation fashion. And you could trace his steps, and you could sit in the room and say, oh, yes, 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 yes. And so it's fascinating, this, how these creative minds work, and they work within a cultural context. And you can't say they didn't copy, but they assimilated these ideas from, Gough Ashur and Frank Lloyd Wright and Rattenbury, the arts and crafts buildings that were here in town, the buildings that he grew up around, the shingle style, and the use of woods for creatively, these kinds of things continued through.
So I knew John, I guess, to his last years, and he had an appetite for architecture. He was enthusiastic. It never dulled. And Frank Lloyd Wright, his eyes would just sparkle, with marvel, And it was a journey of inspiration through his whole life. And it shows in his last project. He wasn't faltering at all. And so it's that attitude that it's just like a studied marvel to have a career like John's, to keep being so creative. I think it's rare.
There's a hand over here, I think. Anyone else?
You mentioned a few times about the modesty of Di Castri's buildings, that they're actually quite small family homes. And I was wondering if that's something that's in response to client requirements or to the land, or whether it's a preference of his design choices. I mean, I was looking at Robin Dunsmuir's house, and obviously, like, Dunsmuir houses of the past are like these monuments to wealth, whereas Robin's house just had 2 bedrooms, and I found that quite surprising. I wondered if Di Castri had any influence over the size of people's homes.
Doug put his finger on it. They were dealing with the economy at the times, but there was a suburban housing dream. This was the dream of my dad's generation coming back from the war. It was to build your own house, and to build, the suburbs were just springing up, and a new car and a television. They were all new things in the 50s. And John was part of that, the suburban family dream. Only he applied design to it. But people were working with pretty constrained budgets often. Now, John did get much more glamorous, large houses over the years. Some of them are, huge budgets. But he didn't shy away from doing modest projects. Kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright had the same idea with his Usonian houses. You design little houses of high creativity for ordinary people that they could afford to live in, and they would have a life experience from the house. So John kind of dedicated himself to that as well.
There's a Di Castri subdivision by Mount Douglas. Does anybody know that? It's
It's around Jamaica Road. I live in a house on Jamaica Road, and the legend was that Di Castri was either involved in the design of at least some of the show homes in that area. So this is like Jamaica Parkside, which is off Cedar Hill, which is off Shelburne.
Are they stylistically compatible with what we've seen tonight? Can you?
I think some of them are. Like, there's a house at the corner of Jamaica and Parkside, if you can look that up on Google Street View, and it's got that sort of a corner window, and if you walk around the neighborhood, so this is like 1961, 62, 63.
Yeah, I've seen an advertisement in the newspaper.
There are, I think if you go there, they're Di Castri's or influenced by him, or maybe there are some other architects.
And that's just about a block or two from the entrance to the park?
Yeah, exactly. So
right backs onto the park.
Literally backs onto the park. And I would like to know more about this. Like, I could see nothing in the colonist archives about the actual design of this. It was, I believe it was the original Van Trite farm.
Yeah, John had actually a kind of a standard formula which he worked around for smaller houses. And he never repeated it, but he repeats the concept. And essentially it's a 2 or 3 level house with a open balcony into usually the bedrooms. And so it kind of, it's on these kind of 3 levels. And I know at least 3 of these. And I have a fake Di Castri. Because the local builders picked up, it's a bit like McLellan, you know. They picked up this formula and kind of ground it out. And of course the proportions are not quite, you know, right, but the notion is there. And so this is another part of it, and I guess we haven't really looked at it, but his influence in the landscape went just beyond his own work, and to the degree to which it was picked up by others. I mean, I don't really know, except that there was this one little formula that did get repeated around the place. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot to be researched and discovered in this topic, and John isn't the only story. There's a very, very good little group of architects around Victoria from that era. And the mid-century thing, you're going to get me ringing one of my bells, but it's kind of like when we were younger and Victorian buildings were being torn down willy-nilly with worse than disregard. It was like an active cause was to undo elaborate decorated buildings because they were sinful in some way. And of course economics were behind it, that people wanted the land cheaply and to redevelop. And I'm afraid the mid-century is undergoing the same danse macabre. You know, we have really beautiful mid-century elements in Victoria. You know, some Di Castri's house is an example. And here I am bringing up a current issue, which is the Centennial Square fountain, which I'm very concerned about the conservation of a beautiful little mid-century iconic kind of feature for Victoria, which has been a signature feature, which can be turned to more practical uses. The idea that's been considered is to create a little water park in the place of the tiara and tear it down. My thesis is they can still put a play park within the tiara, put a metal deck over the pool, removable seasonally, put a filtration system in for the water with water jets, and would convert beautifully into a little play area contained by the ring. You'd have a few steps over the ring, you wouldn't have to tear it away, and it would serve that whole new purpose. And it would cost a fraction of tearing it out and trying to rebuild something. So, you know, humanity, I think, is beset by creativity and also by destructiveness. It's the danse macabre of humanity. So the trick is to work to recognize things that are worthwhile, to maintain the culture of our past.
Feels like a good place to end up. So, great conversation.